Welcome to episode 51 of the Tax Professionals podcast. This episode is all about criminal tax investigations with Barrister Alice Kemp, where she shares tips to help you to avoid the common mistakes that we as tax advisors make when helping taxpayers with such investigations.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Alice is a qualified barrister specialising in criminal tax cases and white-collar crime. She acts for both corporates and individuals in relation to criminal investigations via her role for law firm RPC. She also hosts her own podcast, the RPC Tax in Matters podcast, where I was lucky enough to be a guest last year to share my advice on how to get what you want out of your tax career. Before my conversation with Alice, I knew very little about criminal tax investigations. It's not something I learnt about in my ATT or CTA, and, as it turns out, that's for good reason. It's a very specialist legal area, which requires involvement of legal professionals. However, that doesn't mean as tax professionals we will never cross paths with criminal investigations, and we can play an important role in supporting our clients with them. However, there are some common mistakes that Alice sees us making, so she provides us with some advice to help us avoid these and to best protect our clients and ourselves. As you will hear throughout this episode, criminal investigations are very different to civil ones, including in terms of when they are carried out, in terms of the powers that HMRC has, in terms of the legal system, and in terms of the sanctions. In the episode, Alice shares what a criminal HMRC investigation is. She shares when someone can be subject to criminal investigations, including the fine line between tax avoidance and evasion. She shares the main differences between civil and criminal investigations. She shares the two most common mistakes that she sees tax professionals making when supporting clients with criminal investigations, along with her advice on how to prevent these from happening. And right at the end of the episode, she shares her final tips for tax advisors in relation to criminal tax investigations. You can find the timings for each of these sections in the episode's details within your podcast player, or by heading on over to the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP51. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP51. And TTPP51 just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast, episode 51. Make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast by subscribing or signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The email notifications will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide if you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. When I graduated, my first job choice was to be an actuary, with working in tax as a close second. And even though I've enjoyed all my tax roles, it wasn't until I became CTA qualified that I decided tax was where I wanted to stay. With tax, there's so many different roles and places to work. They all provide something a bit different, and while that's great, it's meant I've spent a lot of time thinking about what areas of tax I want to work in and where I want to take my career long term. I've been caught up in my own thoughts. I've had doubts. I've been unsure. What's been most useful for me is talking to others, saying what I'm thinking, having someone listen, and hearing their advice. The tax recruitment company understands this and can help you with a free career coaching chat with them. They have over 6 years experience in the sector. They can help you explore the options, they can help you decide what's best for you, and they can help you to create a plan to transform your tax career, making you feel more content and happier in your life. You can book a free, no obligation call with them by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free career chat. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free career chat. Thanks to the tax recruitment company for sponsoring the podcast, which is helping me to continue creating episodes. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. So just to start off today's episode then, Alice, when people ask you, what do you do? How do you usually respond?
Well, usually I start with a bit of, oh gosh, that's an interesting question, because the short answer is that I'm a barrister employed at RPC Law, which is a law firm, and I'm employed within the incredibly long team name, which is Tax Disputes, Financial Crime and Regulatory Team. And the slightly longer version of that is that I help companies and individuals who are under investigation or being prosecuted for what are called white-collar crimes. So that's anything really involving dishonesty and property. So tax evasion, fraud, money laundering, bribery, corruption, any of those kinds of offences.
Yeah, I didn't actually know what white-collar was really until you just explained it. So I was actually going to ask that. So thanks for covering that off up front. It's always helpful. So as part of that, you mentioned about criminal tax investigations. So how much of an element is that in your role then and the advice that you provide?
So that's most of what I do, is advising on what are called criminal tax investigations. And that's, most people would think, when they think of HMRC, when they think of tax advice, when they think of tax litigation, in fact, they usually think of HMRC and the tax tribunals and all of those kinds of processes. But that's actually really only half of what HMRC do. HMRC can also conduct a criminal tax investigation, which is where, instead of investigating the tax position, they investigate a criminal offence.
So in terms of criminal offences then, what could that be?
So the most common one, and the one that's usually charged, is the offence, the common law offence of cheating the public revenue, which is basically taking away from the public revenue, either by claiming something you weren't entitled to or failing to pay over something that you really should have. But they all involve dishonesty. And that's one of the essential elements of criminal law, is that it really does involve what is dishonest. So there's a whole line of case law on what that actually means, but it really does boil down to, what do you think and what did they think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds very much like what you're describing there. Is I would use the word fraud to describe that. Is there a reason that you avoid using that word?
Fraud is a specific crime. So then we've got something called the Fraud Act 2006, and that defines exactly what fraud is. Some things fit into it and what the public conception would be of fraud. Some things that people think are fraud aren't actually fraud. They fall into a different crime. For example, theft or tax evasion. Those aren't actually the crime of fraud. And it's an important technical detail, because when you talk about fraud as a criminal lawyer, you mean the specific Section 1 of the Fraud Act 2006. And that's the kind of thing that we think about as fraud. But there are many other crimes that HMRC can charge. And like I said, the most common one is cheating the public revenue. But they can do things like false accounting. They can also do money laundering, although that tends to be charged by basically everybody. And they can also investigate other forms of tax evasion.
And then obviously, as part of your role as well, I believe, well, I think is I at least think it's part of your role, you run your own podcast for RCP.
I do. And you were a very kind guest on the Taxing Matters podcast. Taxing Matters is, as I say every episode, a roadmap designed to give businesses and individuals an idea of what is out there, what is on the horizon. So that's both from a civil perspective, a criminal perspective, and kind of a horizon scanning perspective. What is there? What's coming? What are the issues they should be aware of? And it's designed kind of as somewhere between a landmine map and a Here Be Dragons map. So it's designed to stop you from stepping into something you probably need to stop and think slightly more about.
Good. So then you have already talked a little bit about criminal tax investigations. So if you were trying to explain to someone, I suppose, what actually constitutes a criminal tax investigation outside of the things you've already said, how would you kind of describe it, I suppose, in layman's terms?
Well, probably a good starting point is to start with what HMRC say about it. So as with everything, they have a policy. Of course they do. And their criminal investigations policy says that their criminal investigations are an important part of their overall enforcement strategy. And it's part of their policy that they will use criminal investigations where appropriate to deal with criminal offences. They can, of course, use other mechanisms. So the Code of Practice 9 might spring to mind for certain people, but criminal investigations will be reserved for the cases where it's a very strong deterrent message that needs to be sent, or the conduct involved is such that a criminal sanction, and here we're talking about things like imprisonment or community-based sentences, will be appropriate. So very severe dishonest behaviour, a strong deterrent message to the wider public. So that might be by way of a demonstrative sentence of a common criminal practice that's occurring. So, for example, you might think of cash evasion methods in the hospitality sector, for example, or under-the-table jobs, as they used to be called. And also where civil interventions won't work. So where civil interventions have been tried previously and we're back again looking at the same individual or company. So that's where they'll start to look at criminal investigations.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Code of Practice 9 there, which I've only ever really heard in passing. So does that actually count as a criminal investigation, or is it where there's been criminal action and they're just taking a more civil approach to it?
That's correct. So it isn't a criminal investigation. A Code of Practice 9 is very firmly within the civil sphere, but it does deal with allegations of fraud, so allegations of dishonesty. The other method that HMRC can use to deal with allegations of fraud and dishonesty is to look down the criminal route, but that's an alternative to, or occasionally where a Code of Practice has gone, COP 9 has gone wrong. So it is the alternative to any of those civil forms of investigation.
Again, I think you've already alluded to this a little bit in kind of your introduction, but when is it then that someone can actually be subject to a criminal tax investigation as opposed to just a civil one?
The first point is there actually a crime? So there are a lot of things which HMRC might really want to send a strong deterrent message to the wider public, and civil interventions won't work, but they're not actually a crime. So the first point is it a crime? And one of the things that might be thought of here is aggressive tax avoidance. Not a crime. The HMRC don't like it, that's for sure, but it's not actually a crime. So first point is it a criminal offence? If it's not a criminal offence, you can't use a criminal investigation, somewhat self-evidently. And the second point is it something where they need to go further? So a civil investigation will only go so far. It will only have certain outcomes, and those might not be, in HMRC's view, strong enough. But the real point here is it's their choice. So HMRC can do a criminal investigation of a criminal offence for any taxpayer that they think they want to do one for. But of course, it is a risk, because at the end of a criminal investigation, the matter will be turned over to a court, and the court will make the decision. It's not up to HMRC at that point.
So it sounds like actually if they go down the criminal route, they can actually be taking on more risk almost to...
Sometimes that's true, yeah.
Yeah. And you did mention about actually like tax avoidance or aggressive tax avoidance there as well. Obviously, there is a really grey area where you know whether it falls into the evasion side or the avoidance side. I mean, from your experiences, is there anything that kind of indicates when it does tip into the evasion side and therefore there could be a criminal?
It has to be dishonest. So tax avoidance is not dishonest. It might be not what the law may have intended initially. It might be aggressive. It might be exploiting all of the black letter law loopholes, but it's not dishonest. And that's the dividing line. So it's not necessarily about the behaviour, it's about the intention. If it is dishonest, it can fall into the tax evasion camp. If it is not dishonest, it can't.
Yeah, makes sense. I think one of the things that HMRC and particularly the media is confusing.
Absolutely. There was a really interesting article recently about the crime of avoidance, which is exactly what you're talking about there. It's not really a crime, but it is a grey area that people do get stuck in. And you just have to keep coming back to, if it doesn't have dishonesty, it is not a crime.
Obviously, there is the civil and the criminal tax investigations then. So what would you say are like the main differences between a civil investigation and a criminal one?
They're very, very different, both in process and also in what powers can be used. So what your listeners might be thinking of as a tax dispute where the decision is ultimately decided by the tax tribunals is where they are using a civil investigation route. But criminal investigations have really different powers and really different rules, which determine what HMRC can and can't do. So the biggest difference is, at the end of the process, what the outcomes are going to be are very, very different. So if someone is found guilty, they're sentenced. So those involve all of the sentencing options, and it can involve a sentence of imprisonment if appropriate in the case. It doesn't necessarily need to. There are less than imprisonment options, but that depends on a number of different factors, which I'm not going to go into here because we'd be here all day. But that's the starting point. The next major difference is the court. So criminal tax trials are not heard in the tax tribunals, they're heard in the criminal courts around the UK. So that could be the Crown Court or the Magistrates Court for England and Wales, and I'm not going to go into Scotland because it's a very different jurisdiction up there and I'm not qualified to give any advice on that one. And the other thing I'm sure you've heard about is the backlog of trials. So at the moment, we're looking at trials that are in 2023 or later, just because the backlog of criminal court trials is so severe for some of the courts. And the other thing is that the investigation itself is different. Criminal investigations aren't quick. I can say that right off the bat, they are not quick. They can take anywhere around, the usual point is about 5 years from when you know it's happening to when you actually get a result. And in that time, HMRC can use a number of different powers to compel the production of documents, to execute search warrants, and that's the, what people think of as the kick the door down and everybody freeze. It doesn't actually work like that, but that's what people start thinking about. And the other thing is they can conduct interviews with witnesses and suspects. Sometimes they're under caution, sometimes they're not. And there are very, very strong rules about what happens where. And of course, they can arrest people.
Most importantly. You said there, though, actually, that criminal investigations are not quick, and that was almost implying that civil ones are. And I can tell from my
No,
own
I don't
experience.
think I'd go quite that far.
Yeah, no, I don't think quite as long as 5+ years, but definitely around the 3-year mark I've seen some going on for in the employment taxes arena anyway. So what other examples are there of powers that can be used in a criminal tax investigation that can't be used in a civil one?
So the main thing that everyone thinks of is search warrants. And I will talk about those, but the first thing to think of is the very boring, well, not very boring, but the slightly less interesting production orders. So that is where HMRC goes along to the court and gets an order for the person, the taxpayer, or a third party, including accountants and tax advisors, to produce documents or information. And there are specific rules around what they can do and when they can do that, how they do it, and what you have to provide, and all of those kinds of things. But the most important things are that if you are on the receiving end of one of these production orders, you really do need to start thinking about some specialist legal advice, because they are very, very technical areas. And also, there's some criminal sanctions sitting behind them if you get it wrong. Mm-hmm. But the most usual thing that people think about is a search warrant. Now, it's not kick the door down. It really isn't. Dramatic things can happen, but mostly someone will come in very early in the morning and present you with a piece of paper that says that they are allowed to wander in and take whatever they like. It doesn't actually say that. It says that they're allowed to take specific things at a specific address in a specific date range, relating to specific types of things and relating to specific people. So one of the first points about those is if you are faced with a search warrant, for a start, get legal advice. And also, you need to be very clear about what it is they can and can't do. It's not an unlimited power.
Is there any overlap then between kind of civil and criminal cases?
Absolutely. So what's quite common is that a civil case will sit behind a criminal case. So in addition to a criminal investigation, there will also be some assessments that will be floating around in the background. Now, if you're challenging the assessments and also being criminally investigated, it tends to be the case that the tribunals will stay any other civil case to sit behind the criminal investigation and wait until it's concluded. And that will be the way that it will work. Once you get an answer on the criminal matter, you'll come back to your civil question. But they do usually run somewhat parallel.
Let's say then that there is a case where there's a criminal and civil investigation. Could someone be imposed with criminal sanctions as well as civil sanctions?
Yes. It does seem harsh, but that happens all the time. And unfortunately, with part of the criminal process, there are also what's called confiscation proceedings. So in addition to being sentenced, any criminal benefit, so the value of whatever it was that you did wrong in a white-collar crime context, can also be recovered from you. And they'll have the assessments floating around in the background. Yeah,
no, that does sound very harsh, because isn't one of the sentences that you can be given is a financial penalty, is it?
So there is a financial penalty, a fine can be given, and a confiscation can be given as well. So you'd have not just the fine, but you'd also have the having to repay whatever benefit you got. So the whole point of the criminal process in that situation is that the fine shouldn't just be what you already owed. It'll be more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So when we were talking before recording this episode, Alice, you kind of mentioned that there's almost some common mistakes that tax advisors, accountants and the likes make when trying to support a client with a criminal investigation, because they might not appreciate, say, the risks and that are associated with it. I mean, what are the key ones that you tend to see? I suppose, what is the mistake? And then how can you also then avoid that mistake as well?
So there's a couple of common mistakes, and they fall into maybe two broad headings. The first one is this question of legal professional privilege. So one of the really important things about having a criminal a lawyer involved in a process is that the conversations with a client are covered by legal professional privilege. When they're between the lawyer and the client, there are some interesting fish hooks in that and some technical details that you need to get sorted, but they're sort of outside of the scope of what we're talking about here. The main point is that lawyer and client have a special relationship, and you can't be compelled to provide any evidence about that or any information about what was discussed or what the client said. Now, that doesn't actually apply to accountants and tax advisors. So anything your client tells you, technically HMRC can come along and say, I'd like to know about that, thank you. That can't happen with a lawyer. So those communications are what we call legally privileged. The problem comes when you as a tax advisor or you as an accountant or you as a non-lawyer get involved in that conversation. So if you are running the case with your client to the lawyer, sometimes that can be regarded as not being privileged. So your client tells you something, you tell the lawyer, then you relay the advice backwards. If you get yourself in the middle of that situation, you can, not always, but you can end up in a situation where what the lawyer is being told and what the lawyer is saying is now no longer covered by that privilege. So it can also be seized. And that can create problems where you think you're covered by protections that you've actually not been covered by. The second one is in relation to production orders. So if you get a production order, and it does happen that advisors get the production order instead of the client. If you get a production order, then you have to comply with its terms. But again, you need to be very careful about what exactly it says and what it doesn't say. So there have been situations where documents have been handed over by advisors in good faith, relying on these production orders, but are well outside the scope of what that authority, particularly the HMRC, would be entitled to. So you need to be very careful when thinking about what it is that that person is entitled to. And again, legal professional privilege does come into it. So are you holding documents that are in fact privileged? Should you be making sure that you don't hand those over? And how are you going to tell the difference? So again, specialist advice is really, really important anytime you're facing the criminal justice system.
Just a reminder that you can book a free career coaching chat with the Tax Recruitment Company by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free career chat. The Tax Recruitment Company can help you decide what's best for you and your career. So just coming back to legal professional privilege then for just a minute. So you mentioned kind of where you have this like arrangement where the tax advisor or accountant is almost sitting in the middle between the client and the lawyer. They could lose professional privilege. Well, I suppose what ways can they protect it if a tax advisor or accountant does want to support, or they're needed to help out with the support and advice?
So part of that is making sure that making sure that your client knows that they should be speaking directly to their lawyer. So you can get involved with providing things to them. So on the tax advice side or on the accountancy side, which are going to make those conversations easier, but you need to not be providing being the recipient of the information or being the recipient of the advice. So making sure that you step out of that situation and the client and the lawyer talk directly. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And the other thing is when you ask your client what the lawyer advised, that is very difficult, because if the client tells you exactly what was advised, then that may also be waiving their own privilege. So you need to be very careful about making sure that you know only what you need to know about the legal advice and not all of it. So what directly affects you? What directly affects your ability to do your job? And if it is something that you need more information on, then maybe go and speak to the lawyer, who should be able to direct you without giving away too much.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give you a few scenarios then here. And if you can, I always would like you to tell me whether or not it would be protected by legal privilege or not, if that's okay.
We'll give it a go.
So the first one is, let's say you're in a meeting and you've got the lawyer, the client, and the tax advisor in there. Would that lose the professional privilege or not?
So it depends a lot on what's being talked about. So if you are in a dispute situation already, then there are two types of legal professional privilege. The first is lawyer-client privilege, and that is the one that we talk about most commonly, so legal advice privilege. But there's another type of privilege, which is called litigation privilege, and that protects third-party communications as well, provided that they are in the context of a dispute. So if you're in that meeting because something's going to the tax tribunal and you're trying to work out your strategy and how things are going to play out, then that should be covered by litigation privilege. But if, however, you're just in there kind of to satisfy your own curiosity, that might be a problem.
Okay. So litigation privilege then, so that's only where something is going to, say, the court and you're preparing for that. And if the tax advisor is helping with that, that would still be covered by that one.
In essence, yeah. The technical requirements of that one are that there is a dispute in reasonable contemplation. So it is a real dispute. It's not made up, and it's not just actually an arbitration or anything like that. It's an actual dispute in actual litigation. And also, or it's in reasonable contemplation. So it's not, I'm preparing for the 1% chance of anything going wrong. It's sort of, it's heading that way. And the other thing is that the communication needs to be in relation to it. So if you're just having a chat about other parts of the business and it's a commercial client, that probably isn't covered by litigation privilege.
Okay. So I think the point is there anyways that it's very fact specific and case dependent. Yeah.
As with everything, the legal answer is usually it depends. But just thinking about it, and if necessary, asking about it is a really good starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And the other scenario I've got as well then is, let's say, well, I think it's going to come across to the same answer, to be honest, but let's say there's emails going back and forth between the lawyer and the client, and you as the advisor are copied in to those emails. Would that lose privilege?
Exactly the same answer. Again, it depends. So if you are getting yourself involved in a legal advice situation, then you might have some problems, or rather your client might. If you're involved in a litigation privilege situation, then that should still be covered by litigation privilege. Again, provided that the point of the communication is for some point relating to the litigation.
Okay, but that makes sense, but is a complicated
incredibly
area.
Opaque and complicated, yes.
Yeah. So does that actually, I know we're talking about mainly criminal stuff here, but does privilege equally apply to civil?
It does indeed.
Yeah. I just thought I'd check. You never.
Yeah, it does. The only thing is that it is less common that someone would serve either a production order or a warrant on you, which might need to carve out this legal advice privilege situation or litigation privilege situation. It arises slightly less commonly in civil situations and slightly more commonly in criminal ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can kind of see why. And then back onto the production orders then. So if I was following what you're saying now anyway, I think you might have been saying that sometimes the production order might have things in that are outside of the powers that HMRC actually have.
Absolutely. So the point about production orders is that we'll deal with the most common one. So there's a couple of powers that you can get a production order under, but the most common one is under what's called PACE, so the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, and that covers most of criminal procedure. And what it says is that if there is an indictable offence, so one that's quite serious, and we'll say somewhere in there that it's indictable, and the evidence or the material that's sought would be of substantial value in an investigation, the material is probably held by that person, and it's acquired or created in the course of business, so held subject to some kind of confidentiality or secrecy, and other methods of obtaining that information won't succeed, and it's in the public interest to obtain, then a production order can be made. Now, that production order will specify what the offence is that is under investigation, why it is suspected that that person holds information, what it is suspected that that person holds, how it will help with the investigation, what kind of material it is, and also the details around where to provide it and how to provide it. So you need to be very clear about is this actually within the scope of your production order?
Mm-hmm. So there's always 2 points really. One is HMRC actually allowed to ask for this? And then two, is the stuff that you're giving them in the scope of it, in the actual order that's being created?
Yes. So the first part is dealt with by the courts. So they are the gateholders. You can, of course, challenge that, but most challenges are usually left to the actual criminal trial. There are some powers to challenge a production order, which I'm not going to go into here because they are incredibly technical and detailed, but that is a possibility. The second point is to say, look, this is not within the scope. I don't think that what I'm holding is actually within the scope of what's being asked for. And that does involve a really close reading of your production order to see, for example, date ranges, entities, tax types. All of those things should be in there and you should be able to tell.
Okay, and then so on an actual production order then, because I think you said that there's kind of different law that a production order can be produced under. Would it state on the production order what law it's being issued under?
Absolutely, yeah. That information should be available to you on the face of the production order.
Got it. And then just to make sure I'm following as well then, so actually by the time a production order is actually being issued to someone, it's already been approved by the court. So at that point, really, the chance of successfully overturning that is quite small.
I wouldn't say it's quite small, but it's not what you'd call huge.
Sounds like a very legal response.
It's probably quite true.
So in your view then, Alice, given what we've talked about so far, kind of when should someone go and actually seek a legal professional's advice in relation to, say, production orders or anything else that's to do with a criminal tax investigation?
Basically, the starting point is, if it says the word criminal, you probably need some legal advice. You might also want to start thinking about some legal advice if it uses the word fraud or dishonesty. Like I said earlier, HMRC can choose whether they want to use their civil or their criminal powers when they're looking at fraud. So sometimes they might agree to go down the COP9 route, but other times it might be a criminal investigation. Either way, it's a significant matter. And whole books have been written on what criminal process is, how it's just as technical as tax, but the outcomes can be things like convictions and prison sentences and confiscation proceedings. So it's incredibly important to get it right the first time. And you need to be thinking about that from an early stage. Now, the other point to mention is that there are quasi-criminal matters, which are civil matters that are kind of masquerading as criminal matters, like, for example, unexplained wealth orders or account freezing orders or account forfeiture orders. All of those have their genesis as being the proceeds of crime or unlawful gains. And it's important to get specialist advice when you're dealing with those as well, because they do usually end up in a court situation.
Mm-hmm. So it's just a thought actually that's cropped up to me now, because I know there's a lot of firms out there, accounting firms, that have like specialist tax investigation teams and stuff. From your experience, would they deal with parts of criminal tax investigations, or would they usually only deal with like civil tax
investigations? They usually only deal with civil tax investigations. And the reason being that as soon as you get into criminal, you tend to need legal representation because the matter is probably going to court. So it is very important to get that legal representation as soon as you're starting to think about their criminal process. By and large, unless they have lawyers involved as well, most tax disputes departments will not address criminal tax.
Makes sense. I mean, I've seen a production order once actually since I've been working in tax, but it was actually to our clients, and they weren't investigating our clients. They're actually investigating a different business, but just trying to get information from our clients. I mean, would you put that into the same category in terms of you should seek legal advice in that case?
It's probably worth having a lawyer cast their eye over it, because again, your client, if they're holding information about a third party, is probably holding it according to some kind of obligation of confidence. And it's worth mentioning that if you go beyond the scope of the production order, you may open yourselves up to a civil suit by that client for breaching their confidence. So you do need to stick very, very carefully to the terms of a production order if you do end up with one.
Makes sense. So this is just something I've never really understood the details and the differences between it, but I've heard of the word lawyers, solicitors, barristers, etc. So, who is the right person to go to for criminal tax investigation matters out of those?
Absolutely. So the catch-all is lawyer. When you're talking about a lawyer, you can be talking about a barrister, you can be talking about a solicitor. Solicitors, by and large, would be your first port of call. So most barristers only take instructions from solicitors, although there are those who do public access work. But solicitors will have the experience in the first part, that investigative part, and that is where you're probably likely to be starting. Barristers are the end point, the kind of mouthpiece. I can call myself a glorified mouthpiece because, in fact, I am a barrister. And your job is to stand up and to present the case to the court. And it's the solicitor's job to prepare that case for the court or to make sure that the client is getting all of their legal options at the time they need them.
So it's kind of a bit off topic for the episode, but so, for example, we've sought opinion from barristers before. So that's obviously, that seems like you can also get an opinion from a solicitor. So it's like a benefit of going to one over the other. Almost.
Solicitors tend to see the matter through right from the start. So it's quite common on criminal matters that you'll have both involved. So you'd have your solicitor who's working in the background to prepare the case for court, and then you'd have your barrister who is going to be standing up and preparing it for court. And the solicitor and the barrister will ask for each other's assistance. So the barrister might give an opinion on the law and how it will apply to the particular matter, and the solicitor might be going away and getting expert opinions on different other bits. So that is where accountants and tax advisors feed into the processes, that they will usually be liaising with the solicitor and making sure that that information is available for the barrister to use when they eventually stand up in court.
Okay, so they're almost like the legal person, the solicitors are the legal person who understand everything and almost like collects all the information needed for the barrister.
Sort of like that, yeah.
I know I'm simplifying. So then just the last question then for you, Alice. So we've obviously talked about quite a few things already and a lot of tips have already been given, but are there any kind of final tips that you'd like to give people who are supporting clients with criminal tax investigations?
So there's sort of two main tips that I'd say. The first is that this is likely to be your client's most stressful time of their life. Criminal investigations are scary, they're long, and they're very, very intense. So they're likely to be relying on you quite a lot for not just for advice and direction, but also for a degree of support. And it's probably quite a lot for you as well. But just remember that legal advisors are there for your support and also to help you to support your client. And the second thing is criminal investigations take a long time, but they're very important that each stage gets done properly. So it is really significant that you get the advice that you need from wherever you need it as soon as you realize there's a need, because there's nothing worse than making a mistake right at the start that does tend to influence the outcome, and usually not in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. And then I just had a final thought as well, actually, Alice. Just because someone's actually subject to a criminal tax investigation, that doesn't actually mean they've done anything wrong, does it? They could.
No, absolutely not. It might be a misunderstanding. It might be that they've been involved by their business partner, husband, wife, someone who's taken them in. All of those things are possible. It's also possible that no crime has been committed. Like we were talking about earlier, it might be a suggestion that it was tax evasion, but actually it's just a really aggressive tax avoidance, but there was no dishonesty. So just because there is a criminal investigation does not mean, one, that a crime was committed, or two, that your client committed the crime.
Yeah. So I suppose that's one way that we can be reassuring to clients, is to say, just because they've started this, that doesn't actually mean you've done anything wrong. We just need to now deal with it properly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you for that, Alice. Where can people go to kind of learn about more about you and your podcast and anything else that you would like to point people towards?
So on that last point, we are launching a resource which is going to be available by subscription, a free subscription to anyone who wants to get more information about how the law actually works in either civil or criminal law. So we've got this new website launching, which is going to be called Tax Take Plus, and it will be launching in the new year, and we'll have all of the advice that you could want, and also the ability to ask us questions without cost implications to you or your clients. So if you do have a simple question, it might be that the answers will be on there. If not, we might be able to direct you to somewhere where they might be. And that website is going to be available shortly. But in the meantime, if you are interested, you can email us on taxtake, TAXTAKE, at rpc.co.uk, and we'll make sure that you're made aware when that website does go live. And of course, if you are interested in the Taxing Matters podcast, that's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, and through our website at www.rpc.co.uk/taxing matters. And if you want to get hold of me, I'm Alice Kemp, and I am alice.kemp@rpc.co.uk.
The links mentioned throughout the episode can be found in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP51, along with details of where you can find out more about Alice and the fantastic RCP Taxing Matters podcast. I joined Alice back in 2021 to share my advice on how to get what you want out of your tax career so that you can start your journey to getting there. The link to that episode is included within the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe or sign up for email notifications to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes. The emails will give you a brief summary of each episode, which are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.